much. Here we are in West Berlin, ladies and gentlemen. West Berlin, that's a PX surrounded by Russians. I don't know what you guys did to get here, but let that be a lesson to you.
My name is Steve Scott. I'm a volunteer docent at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, and I have the privilege and the joy of spending my days here in the Bob Hope exhibit, sharing our visitors a story about an amazing human being that dedicated 50 years of his life to supporting our men and women in uniform. Bob, from the time he was just a little boy, a teenager, was what we would call today probably the class clown.
I was born in England, and I left at a very early age because I knew there was very little chance of me becoming king.
By the time he was in his 20s, he had gotten involved in vaudeville, was starting to get successful and be recognized. By the 1930s, early 1930s, Bob started his first Broadway play. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Bob and his lifelong best friend, Bing Crosby, were visiting a mutual friend of theirs, Elliott Roosevelt. And yes, you're right, Elliott was the son of President Roosevelt. On the radio, they heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Both Bob and Bing looked at Elliott and said, "We want to join the Navy. We want to be part of this." Elliott called his father in the White House and called the Secretary of Navy, who subsequently offered both Bob and Bing direct commissions in the Navy. President Roosevelt called back, essentially saying, "Bob, we appreciate your willingness. However, my cabinet and I recognize the true value that you have on the morale of our troops, and we need you to keep doing what you do best, so we're going to ask you to do that."
Careful, careful. Snipers.
As I walk through the museum and I look at all the awards and trophies he received from presidents and heads of state, and I know all those things were important to him, but I always come back to one simple letter. In 1944, Bob and his small group of entertainers were on their second large global tour of World War II, and this tour was of the South Pacific.
I think one of the most emotional shows I ever played was when I played for the 1st Marine Division in Pavuvu down in the South Pacific, because we were playing an island called Bonica, and this fellow flew over and said, "Could you possibly do an extra show for the 1st Marine Division? They've never had a show, and they would really love to see, and they're going to invade Peleliu." And so we flew over the next morning, and you knew when you walked out there that you're playing for 15,000 kids, that a lot of those guys you never see again.
There's a letter that Bob kept, and it was a letter from a mother of one of those young Marines that he entertained on the island of Pavuvu. Essentially, it starts, "Bob, I know you get a lot of fan mail. I hope you'll read this." The bottom of the letter is a comment saying, "I just want you to know what you meant to my son on the last day of his life." When I think about all the differences he made in the lives of so many, out of all those things, and they're just overwhelming, I truly believe the one thing that he did better than anything else was to provide hope. And that's kind of ironic because that's his name. We have a whiteboard that has probably hundreds of little notes on it. And one of the things we encourage our visitors, especially their children, to do is that if they're touched by Bob and his stories and the difference he made in the lives of millions, to write him a little note. And when I look over at that board, I see hundreds and hundreds of notes written by young people that have heard the stories and have smiled and said, "Wow, this man really made a difference." And they take a moment to thank him. I truly hope that if you have an opportunity, you should really come and invest an hour of your day to walk through this museum, to see the world through the eyes and the soul of a man that gave so very much of his life to try to make this world a happier, saner, more positive place, especially for our men and women in uniform that are asked to sacrifice so very much for all the rest of us.